Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. You can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. Jordan has a long history of close economic and security ties with the United States, but the bilateral partnership has come under strain during President Donald Trump's time in office. Many of Trump's policies in the region, especially his support for Israeli settlements in the West Bank and his decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, were criticized by Jordanian leaders. And King Abdullah II rejected Trump's one-sided proposal for a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians. It was no surprise then that Abdullah was one of the first world leaders to congratulate Joe Biden for his victory over Trump in last month's presidential election. And in a phone conversation with Abdullah last week, his first with an Arab leader, Biden told the king that he hopes to cooperate on pursuing a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It remains unclear, though, just how much of a priority that can be for Biden as he enters office with a herculean to-do list. Today on Trendlines, we'll be talking about what Biden's presidency will mean for Jordan, for the Israelis and the Palestinians, and for U.S. policy toward the Middle East writ large. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk about these important issues with one of the region's preeminent policymakers and scholars. Marwan Mouasher has had a front row seat to the evolution of U.S.-Jordan relations and the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. He served in a number of high-profile positions in Jordan's government, including foreign minister and deputy prime minister, and he's now vice president of studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's joining us from Amman. Marwan, welcome to Trendlines.
Thank you, Elliot. It's good to be here.
To kick things off, could you give us a sense of what the reaction was in Jordan when it became clear that Joe Biden would replace Donald Trump as president next January?
It's largely been one of relief, both on the popular level as well as on the official level. President Trump's dealing with the Middle East have been extremely well-sided in his support for Israel. His deal of the century, as he called it, is a one-sided deal that would serve the interests of Israel, while none of the Palestinians and also none of Jordan. This deal would kill the two-state solution by agreeing to annexing 30% of the West Bank. And if it does so, Jordan was very concerned that it would end up in trying to find a solution at Jordan's expense. The two-state solution is extremely important for Jordan because it establishes a Palestinian state on Palestinian soil rather than what several Israeli politicians have been calling for, which is to say that Jordan is Palestine. And so today it's a sign of relief, Elliot. We at least will be dealing with a president whose approach to foreign policy is not erratic. President-elect Biden has had a long history of dealing with foreign affairs. He was, after all, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee at the Senate, a position in which I had the chance to work with him very closely on issues concerning Arab-Israeli peace in my time.
The bilateral relationship with Washington is obviously very important to Jordan as well, not least because it receives a lot of U.S. economic and military aid. But certainly, like you just mentioned, a big part of the reason the relationship seemed to sour during Trump's time was because of his one-sided approach to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more, just for the sake of background, about why this issue is so important to Jordan and just how significant the Trump administration's divergence from traditional U.S. policy was, in your view.
For the last 30 years, the peace process has been premised on the issue or on the objective of separating the two communities, the Palestinians and the Israelis, on ending the Israeli occupation, and on establishing a Palestinian state on Palestinian soil, meaning in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. Jordan's afraid is very concerned that if Israel is not serious about a two-state solution, And today it is very clear that it is not, and that President Trump has encouraged it to act in this manner. And if Israel also does not want a Palestinian majority in areas under its control, and today the number of Palestinians living in Israel proper, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, is more than the number of Israeli Jews. It's 6.9 million Palestinian Arabs to 6.6 million Israeli Jews. So if Israel does not want a Palestinian state and does not want also a Palestinian majority in areas under its control, then Jordan is very concerned that Israel might try either to create conditions or make use of conditions that would result in mass transfer of Palestinians from the West Bank into Jordan, and thus solve the problem at its own expense. Trump was not in tune with these concerns. In fact, in my opinion, President Trump has treated Jordan as collateral damage. In other words, while maybe not intentionally intending to hurt Jordan, the Trump plan would have resulted in the death of the two-state solution and in hurting Jordan as a result. And it is not insignificant that King Abdullah has not had a meeting with President Trump in the last 2 years, which shows the fact that the Trump White House has ignored Jordan and its concerns for a long time. With President-elect Biden, I think the relationship with the White House, because the relationship with the United States is a very solid one, and the relationship with its Congress, both in both parties, in Jordan enjoys an excellent relationship with Congress. But with the White House, the relationship has certainly suffered some strains, and I would fully expect that those strains would disappear and the relationship would go back to what it used to be with President-elect Biden.
Already during the phone call, it seemed like there was a very positive sign that Biden sent just by pledging to work together on a two-state solution, something that the Trump administration had been more averse to.
Yes, although I must point out that while I think that President Biden is very sincere in his wish to effect a two-state solution, and I know that from personal knowledge, having worked with him, I'm afraid that the Arab-Israeli conflict might not be high on the new administration's priority list. President-elect Biden is going to be very busy in trying to domestically repair the rift in U.S. society, in dealing with COVID-19, and internationally, he is going to also be busy with repairing the rift with the Europeans in a different relationship with China. And I'm afraid that the Arab-Israeli conflict, beyond some tactical changes, for example, like I said, at least the deterioration that the Trump administration has resulted in, at least that deterioration will stop. But whether the new administration is going to have the bandwidth to launch a serious effort, not just to support a two-state solution by rhetorically, but to actually have a solid plan in mind to effect it before it is too late, is something that is still very much an open question.
If we assume that that is the case for the sake of argument, and also given that there isn't much appetite to meaningfully engage with the Palestinians from the Israeli side, as you just mentioned, what do you foresee for the next few years on the Arab-Israeli peace process? Will it be more of a kind of holding pattern? And what does that mean for the Palestinians themselves?
It is difficult for the conflict to enter into a holding pattern simply because the status quo is not sustainable. We have a situation in which the number of settlers is increasing by the year, and that makes separating the two communities just about impossible. When the Oslo Agreements were signed in 1993, the number of settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem was 250,000 settlers. Then it was possible to separate the two communities. Today, that number has tripled to 700,000 settlers. And so the scenario you just outlined is probably the most likely scenario in which the international community and the US is still going to stick to the mantra of a two-state solution while doing little to affect it on the ground. Meanwhile, Israel is going to annex more land and introduce more settlers into the West Bank, such that separation will become impossible. Some people argue, as I do, that it is already impossible. What happens then? I think we are already seeing signs where the Palestinians, especially among the new generation, are shifting their focus from one on the shape of a solution to a rights-based approach. What they seem to be saying today among the new generation is, if we cannot have a state of our own in the West Bank and Gaza, then we need to ask for equal political rights in the state that we live under, which is Israel, because we cannot be living indefinitely as occupied people. This is, after all, the longest occupation in modern history. And so the argument, the whole conflict is going to shift from one that focuses on the shape of the solution to one that focuses on rights. In this time and age, particularly in the United States, US public opinion, as well as the international public opinion, is going to find it very difficult to keep saying to the Palestinians no to a state and no to equal rights. That means yes to apartheid, because we are already living in a one-state reality. It is an apartheid state, basically, where people are under occupation, under separate legal regime for the last 57 years. This is where I believe the conflict is shifting towards, and this is what the international community is going to have to face if a two-state solution is not realized.
How much of a concern is it that as conditions worsen for the Palestinians, more refugees might flow into Jordan, adding to an already substantial burden given the number of refugees that Jordan hosts?
Today, Jordan is a population of 10 million. 7 million are Jordanians, both East Jordanian and Jordanians of Palestinian origin who came to the country after the 1948 war. There are 3 million additional refugees, whether they are Syrian, Iraqis, or other nationalities. So already Jordan, has a huge burden in receiving refugees. We are not talking about those refugees that became Jordanian citizens. As I said, the vast majority of Palestinians who came to Jordan after the 1948 war are today Jordanian citizens. We cannot receive a lot more. The number of refugees today in the country that came because of the Syrian and Iraqi wars is equivalent to the whole of Canada coming to the United States. So obviously, Jordan, with its meager resources, with its water poor situation, we are the second poorest country in the world in terms of per capita income share of water. Jordan cannot receive more refugees, and so of course it is of a huge concern to the country, and that is why Jordan, in all its peace dealings, went to Madrid as part of an Arab delegation, signed a peace treaty with Israel, precisely because its objective was to end the occupation and establish a Palestinian state on Palestinian soil rather than inside Jordan.
Are there any elements of Trump's approach to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, including steps that Trump has taken throughout his administration, like the embassy move, for instance, and the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel? Are there any things that Biden might choose to keep or might be forced to keep?
I think it is safe to assume that Biden will resume aid to UNRWA, the UN agency responsible for Palestinian refugees. It is safe to assume that Biden is going to re-establish the US consulate in Jerusalem to deal with the Palestinians. And it is safe to assume that contacts with the Palestinian leadership will also resume. But I don't think that Biden is going to be able to reverse the decision to move the US embassy to Jerusalem. That is something that is going to require congressional approval, and I don't think that is coming. Biden will also ditch the Trump plan, basically, and that is important, an important move, because at least, as I said earlier, at least it would stop the deterioration, keep the hopes of a two-state solution alive, and keep hope for dealing with the two parties in a somewhat balanced way. The Trump plan was totally one-sided, and it was a total non-starter. So these are the issues that Biden will be able to keep, but other issues that he will not be able to keep.
This year, the Trump administration has brokered a number of historic deals in which Israel agreed to normalize its relations with some Arab neighbors. So far, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain have done so, and there are some reports suggesting that Saudi Arabia might be close but is holding off. How exactly have these agreements reshaped the landscape, so to speak, for engaging on the Israeli-Palestinian issue?
Again, for the last 30 years, the premise of the peace process has been land for peace. Israel withdrawing from Arab land it occupied in 1967 in return for Arab states signing peace treaties with Israel. The bilateral agreements between Bahrain and the Emirates and Israel, and I call them bilateral agreements, not peace agreements, because they do nothing for peace. They have switched this argument and gave Israel a false impression that it no longer has to deal with the Palestinians, that it can forge peace treaties with the rest of the region without solving the central part of the problem, which is dealing the Palestinians, who, after all, are the ones living in the midst of Israelis, not the other Arab nationals. This is the danger. It is not that these deals are rejected, but the question is: do they contribute to the solution, a permanent solution of the Arab-Israeli conflict, or do they, as I am claiming, give Israelis and Israel the false impression that they no longer have to withdraw from Arab territory in order to reach peace? Yes, maybe peace with Arab countries, but they will not be able to reach peace with the Palestinians, who form the central part of the problem.
Is there a chance that with normal diplomatic relations, more Arab countries will lobby the Israeli government to sincerely engage with the Palestinians? Or should these deals be seen as a sign that there just isn't much of an appetite among Arab countries to push on this issue?
Look, Israel, the first peace treaty that Israel signed with any Arab country was Egypt, the largest of all Arab countries. And that treaty has been signed in 1978. So a long, long time ago, more than 40 years ago. It did not result in Israel changing its position on the Palestinian issue and withdrawing from Arab land occupied in 67. So I don't have much hope that signing a deal with small countries like Bahrain or the Emirates are going to result in achievements that the biggest Arab country, Egypt, was not able to do.
You mentioned earlier that you have some experience dealing with Joe Biden when he was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and meeting him. I wonder if there are any experiences or any anecdotes from that time that might lead you to have some predictions or what implications his presidency might mean for the relationship with Jordan, but also the U.S. stance toward the Middle East overall.
Biden has been in Washington for the better part of 50 years. He has been in the Foreign Relations Committee, been in Congress at the Senate for a very long time. He has been vice president for 8 years. He understands international relations and affairs in a way that President Trump does not, to be absolutely frank. And he understands the importance of international relations. He understands the importance of issues like climate change. He understands the importance of dealing with the Europeans in a positive manner. So, and I think that the appointments President-elect Biden has made so far have been what I would call mature appointments. You know, people who represent the diversity of US society, but people who also represent the experience that the United States is going to need to repair the damage that has been inflicted in the last 4 years. And so, on a personal side, President elect Biden is a very seasoned politician. He's very easy to work with. He's very humble. He understands international relations. Doesn't mean that you have to agree with him all the time, but it does mean that you can have a meaningful and thoughtful conversation, one that is built on trust, one is built on experience, and in that manner, you can at least hope to achieve results. That wasn't, unfortunately, the case with the Trump administration.
Switching gears a little bit to discuss the domestic side in Jordan, your country also had an election last month, despite calls to postpone it due to the coronavirus pandemic. I'm wondering to what extent that decision was related to the prospect of a change in administration in Washington.
I'm not sure it was, Elliot. Yes, we did have elections. I think we still domestically in Jordan have a way to go before our elections, no matter at what time they are made. The result in strong parliament that can exercise true supervision over the executive and that can lead to a system of checks and balances so that the executive is not dominant in decision making in this country. That has been an objective that has eluded us for quite some time. And I would not place emphasis on the timing of the election. I would place more emphasis on modern electoral laws that would result in strong parliaments, because you know the current law is not going to result in any strong parliament capable of exercising its powers under the Constitution. That's what concerns me more.
Was it also concerning that this election had a historically low turnout? Although I imagine that would also have been due to the pandemic.
It is concerning that it had a low turnout. We've never had very high turnouts in parliamentary elections because there is a trust gap between people and their institutions, including parliament, which they do not see as representative or credible. The last elections, we've had 34% participation rate, or also a very low turnout. This time we had less than 30%. So obviously, people are, I think, definitely concerned with Corona. But more than that, I would say, even all the polls showed that even pre-Corona sentiments were against the elections, not because people do not want parliaments, but because they feel that the current electoral laws do not produce the kind of parliaments that they can claim represents them in a fair way.
Getting back to the U.S. approach to the Middle East as a whole, what kind of changes do you expect in terms of the U.S. relationship with Iran, which has been a big point of contention that has concerned a lot of countries in the Middle East under the Trump administration?
I think President-elect Biden will try to revive the deal with Iran on the nuclear issue. However, times have changed, and I don't think that you can turn the clock back to the same deal that President Obama signed. That's one. Two, there is a lot of concern in the region that the deal that was signed did not take into account Iranian interference in the region's political issues. And as we all know, the interference is widespread in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in the Gulf. And so the region at least hopes that if a new agreement with Iran is signed, that some of these concerns will be taken into consideration other than just the nuclear issue.
Do you think that would take the form of a new agreement in which both that and also the nuclear issue and perhaps also ballistic missiles and other aspects of Iran's behavior are all addressed in one? Or would it be better off to address them in separate standalone agreements?
Well, it remains to be seen. That's also an open question. Obama's argument was that if he was to load the agreement with all the issues at once, that he would, arrive at no agreement. The region's view is that the nuclear issue is an important one, and there is a need to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions, but it is also important to curb Iran's political ambitions beyond its borders. And to the region, these are the two main issues that one would hope are addressed in any new deal.
Marwan, thank you so much for joining us today on Trendlines. We really appreciate you making the time.
Thank you.
Marwan Muasher is a former foreign minister and deputy prime minister of Jordan, who's now vice president for studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He joined us from Amman, Jordan. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman, that's with 2 L's and 1 T. And Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.